Hi, I'm Adam Booth, and I'm going to share with you an old Appalachian version of a very popular story, one that you might recognize by the time we get to the end. The curtains were closed tight, and fresh white sheets were stretched out across the bed, and handfuls of flower petals scattered throughout the room perfumed the air. You see, the deathbed had been made. Because just that morning, when the queen woke up, she felt something behind her head, in the pillow. When they opened it, they looked and saw that all the feathers had formed together into a nest shape, going widdershins. It was the death crown, a sign that she would not live to see the end of the day. And because she was the queen, very few people were allowed to see her. The very last one was her own daughter. "Oh, Jenny," she said, as she touched her daughter's face, "because I married the king, I have very little to give you as an inheritance. But I do have this." She slipped a ring from her finger and pushed it into her daughter's hand and said, "Jenny, when you wear it, remember to be as strong as the gold band and as bright as the light that shines through the diamond." Jenny held it there and didn't put it on until her mother had breathed her last breath and pieces of silver were placed over her eyes. It was not even a week later that Jenny was out in the king's fields, watching the flowers blow in the breeze and watching the king's workers do their daily tasks, when to her surprise, there was a sound of bagpipes. She turned and saw a whole royal procession coming through the field, starting with the king's mouth, the worker who spoke for him, with all different types of musicians and servants, and at the end, the king being carried on a throne that was up on poles. And she was even more surprised to see that it came directly to her. The king's mouth spoke. "The king wishes you to know he has intentions to remarry." "Remarry?" she said. "But my mother hasn't even been dead for a week. When is he going to remarry?" "The king wishes you to know he will remarry tomorrow, and your presence is demanded." "Tomorrow?" she said. "But my mother hasn't even been in the ground for 3 days. Everybody knows this. Who would he be marrying?" "The king wishes you to know he will marry you." "Me?" she said. And she looked off into the field and saw one of the king's workers in the distance wrestling with a beast of burden, a donkey. At one end, that worker was pulling a rope that was attached around the donkey's neck, and the donkey was braying and resisting and stomping its hind quarters. And in that moment, Jenny felt a kindred relationship with that donkey. Marry the king? My own stepfather? That would be a worse burden than having to live in the skin of that donkey. The king's mouth ran back to the throne on the poles and then ran back to Jenny and said, "If that's what you wish, then that is what you shall have." And those strong men that had been carrying those poles ran up and grabbed a hold of Jenny and drug her across the field. They took her down to a long building. Inside, there was a farm table, atop which a donkey's carcass was resting. It had died the day before, and they were drying it out for leather. "If this is what you wish, this is what you will have." And they took that donkey's carcass and laid it over her backside, and took lengths of rope and tied it to her body. The hooves were right around the heels of her feet, and rope around her ankles. The tail came off of her own rear, and it was laid across her back, and then down her arms were the donkey's front legs, and tied around her wrists so the hooves were here. and then its neck and mane over her neck, and its head rested above the crown of her head. And she resisted, but those strong men held her tight, and for the next 3 days that donkey skin grew taut over her backside until it couldn't be removed. And she had struggled so much that she passed out in exhaustion, and they lifted her up and took her down to a stable and laid her in one of the stalls reserved for a donkey. And it was some time later that she came to, and it was because something was licking in her ear. It was wet and wriggling around, and she looked. It was a donkey. Another donkey, and its tongue was right there in her ear. "You stupid beast," she said, "get away, ugh!" And she stood up and tried to shoo it away, but she couldn't stand up. That skin was on her back. She could only stand up as tall as on all fours. And so that's how she left the stable, and that's how she left the king's land. Sometime later, she was out in the wild and happened to see a cool mountain rill running down through a glen. And she was thirsty, so she made her way to the water, cupped her hand, and was bringing it to her mouth for a drink. When she thought she noticed something stirring over here. So she turned to see what it was. Aha! There stood a woman with a rope, and she threw it around the donkey's neck. "I got you," she said, and she pulled like this. And Jenny said, "No, no." She caught it with her thumbs, and she stood up, and the woman saw that it wasn't a donkey. It was a young woman in a donkey skin, and she stood up like this, and the woman dropped the rope, and she said, "Get back. What are you, some kind of fawn? Satyr? Demon?" "No," Jenny said, "no. I'm actually a princess trapped in a donkey skin." "Well, why would that be?" "Because of something I said. Because of something I wouldn't do." Well, that woman, she was an innkeeper. She had an inn and a tavern, and she collected young women who were a little bit queer. Women that didn't fit in other places. And in this situation, she thought she should extend an invitation. "I have a tavern not far from here. You could work for me if you wish. There's not much work to do. You'd start as a scullery maid, boiling water, cleaning dishes. But you could stay there if you're looking for a home." And as the woman spoke, Jenny found that she was listening and turning that ring around her finger, because there was something maternal about this woman. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that very much." So that's what happened. She moved into the inn in a room on the second floor, not very large, and she started working in the back of the tavern as a scullery maid. She stayed back there with the other young women who worked there. She never ever dared go through the swinging door that led to the front where the guests ate, for fear that they might see her and be afraid. Well, she was a good worker, so good that soon she was promoted to making soup. In fact, the innkeeper taught her herself. And one day, that innkeeper popped back through that swinging door and hollered to Jenny, "2 bowls of soup, best you got, lickety-split," and was gone. Well, a number of the other young women wondered, why would she be acting like that? And one of the more intrepid workers made her way to the swinging door and peeked into the front area. There's a king out there from a faraway land, and he's brought his son with him, a prince. Now, many of the young women who worked back there wanted to meet that prince. Maybe he would marry them, and they could become a princess. Now, not all of them wanted to meet him and have that happen, but some of them did. So they grabbed up gifts and little trinkets to take to him, and they took off running out to that door and into the front part of the building. And as they ran, Jenny, she was just ladling her bowls of soup, and one of those women ran right past her and bumped into her back so hard that the ring slipped from her finger. Splashed down into the bowl of soup. "My ring!" She went for it, but another young woman snatched up those bowls and ran. "I'll take these to the prince, thanks," and was gone. And Jenny ran to the door, but she didn't dare go through it. She was so sad, she made her way up to her room directly, and she stayed there until it was dark outside. And only then did she step out onto her balcony. She looked down at the flowers behind the building, blowing in the night breeze, in the moonlight. She noticed that moonlight was moving. The moon was moving through the sky until it shone right over her, and it called down, "Girl, why do you cry?" Why do I cry? My mother is dead. I have to live in this donkey skin. And then I lost my ring today. Why do you think I cry? Girl, I can help, but just for a little bit. And the moon blew a breeze down all around. And when the breeze blew over Jenny, that donkey skin lifted right off of her backside and into the shadows of the balcony. The breeze blew through the flowers and lifted up petals and dropped them all over her hair. The breeze blew through the tips of the blades of grass and picked up dew diamonds and bejeweled her face with them. She looked to see what was coming next. But down there in the flowers was the prince. See, he had been inside trying to enjoy his supper when all of a sudden all these women ran out and around him, throwing gifts at him and making flirty eyes. And social anxiety existed back in the old folk tales too. So he had to get away from them. He stepped out behind the building to get a breath of fresh air, and he was looking around the flowers, speaking to himself. Don't they understand? Marriage isn't about gifts. It's not about becoming royal. Marriage is about... And then he heard a voice finish the sentence. Love. He looked up and on the balcony saw the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen in his life. But that didn't matter, because in one word, she understood him more than any woman ever had. Yes, he said, that's right. How do you know that? Because, she said, I was faced with a similar situation once myself. Well, if you understand love like that, why are you crying? Because, she said, just this evening, I lost my ring in a bowl of soup. Really, he said, as he moved his hand to his pocket. But before anything else could be said, the breeze stopped. And she turned and saw that donkey skin was floating back to her. I have to go. And she jumped into the shadows. No, he said, I wish to know you more. He ran inside and asked all around if anybody knew a woman who matched the description that he gave, but no one knew any woman who looked like that. Well, he thought, I have her ring. I can put it on people's fingers until I find the woman who has a finger that fits this ring. And he took that ring around through all the towns and hollers throughout the hills and tried it, but it didn't fit anyone's finger. And so one day, sometime after that, he made his way back to the tavern. He made his way to the garden behind, where he had first seen that young woman. And there he saw a donkey eating at some of the flowers. And as he came close to that donkey, he placed his hand on its backside, and it startled and stood up. And she saw, for it was really the princess in the donkey skin, she saw the prince. Don't look at me, she said, don't look. And she held up her fingers to cover her face, but she held up her fingers. And he placed that ring, and it fit. And in that moment, the moon passed over the sun, and everything went dark. It was a wonder. And when it had passed fully over and the sun came back out, the donkey skin was gone. It's you, he said. Yeah. And it's you. Yes. And there was something so special about that it was not a whole year later that the curtains had been closed tight, and fresh white sheets were stretched across the bed, and handfuls of flower petals scattered about the room perfumed the air, because the birthing bed had been made. A birthing bed that soon would see the birth of a child, a daughter, a princess who would one day grow up to wear her grandmother's ring.